worldwide affairs have a place in your day, this is the place you will want to stay. The Ron Bobb-Semple International Podcast with your host, world-renowned voice of Garvey and global news commentator, Ron Bobb-Semple.
Greetings and welcome to the Ron Bobb-Semple International Podcast. We will be addressing global issues that impact our day-to-day lives.
Congolese have been massacred by white people in the Congo for years and years and years. And if the shoe is now on the other foot, only thing I can say is it's like chickens that always come back home to roost. I think that the white people should be ashamed of the deplorable situation that has been existing in the Congo, which is not the fault of the Congolese, but which is the result of instigation by European powers who are fighting each other over the mineral wealth of the Congo. And now to make it appear that the Congolese themselves are criminals or brutes because they're reacting to these injustices that they've been victimized by is again ducking the question.
On Thursday, July 2nd, 1925, Mother Earth was blessed with the birth of two historic figures in the African community. Nationalist leader and the first Prime Minister of the Belgian Congo, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, as well as civil rights activist and World War II veteran Medgar share the same birth date. Joining us with his perspective on these two icons is Dr. Samuel Livingston, an African-centered researcher of Black culture, leadership, and resistance movements, and associate professor of Africana Studies at Morehouse College. My brother, greetings, and welcome to the Ron Bobb-Semple International Podcast.
Greetings, Brother Bobb-Semple. It's very good to be with you today.
Absolutely. Dr. Livingston, you are a Gullah native from the North Santee community of Georgetown, South Carolina. What is so unique and intriguing about the Gullah culture?
Good question. I think the Gullah communities, and, I emphasize that, we're talking about the communities that extend from Wilmington, North Carolina in the north, all the way down to Jacksonville, Florida, along the coast in Jacksonville, Florida toward the south. I think those communities stand out for the connection to Africa and the retention of African culture, linguistic patterns, cooking styles. And sometimes we're talking about just clear African retentions, but then sometimes we're also talking about a unique brand or cultural style that became pronounced in that area. And, I think historically is significant also, not just for the culture. We don't just cook a mean pot of Hoppin' John and that's it, but historically very significant as well. The first enslaved Africans were brought to that area in 1526, early August or late July of 1526, the year 1526. And those 100 Africans who were brought by a Spaniard basically engaged in the first slave rebellion. After the first slave rebellion in what would become the United States in 1526 of that year. And they struck in solidarity with the Native Americans, whom the Spaniards were exploiting very, very heavily. And I think that they would start a resistance tradition that would run through slavery. So when we think about some of the major slave rebellions, some of them occur in that area of what we call the Low Country. David Walker, who wrote David Walker's Appeal, was born in that area. In Wilmington, North Carolina. Denmark Vesey planned his rebellion for Charleston in 1822, also in that area. The Stono Rebellion in 1739 took place just outside of Charleston in that area. So the Gullah community has a very rich history of resistance, of African cultural retention. I would say also politically, it's a significant area as well. If we think about the 2015 assassination of the Mother Emanuel 9, really you're talking about an effort of one lone gunman to murder and assassinate Black folks who are participating in the political process. And, Mother Emanuel, that's the mother church of Denmark Vesey's slave rebellion. It's also a site where the Black community in Charleston tried to reorganize itself and to organize itself politically, of course. So I always say that Dylan Roof, even though he pulled the trigger on those 9 Charlestonians, that there was a longer effort to remove African people from the Charleston Peninsula, which has this very rich history and is considered by many to be one of those cultural primate cities of Gullah culture. So it's a unique history, and it extends into the present day. That tradition extends to the present day. And I would also say, just real brief, we need more Black people to move back down to that area. It doesn't matter, as long as you're going to come down and bring something positive to the community. Come on down. There's land, and we really need to try to hold on to much of the heirs property that you see sometimes slipping out of the hands of the Gullah people. So we need conscious, community-minded, politically aware Black folks who are not going to come down and endorse white supremacy. Let's make sure we say that. Don't come down with white supremacy politics.
Leave it where you are, right?
Leave that where you are. But if you can come and support some progressive politics to make life better for people, then amen.
Awesome. The Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, is named after the Congo River, which flows throughout the country. The Congo River is the world's deepest river and the world's second largest river by discharge. Its population is over 90 million natives. Why is the DRC, Dr. Livingston, so important to the history of Africa?
If you don't mind, Brother Bobb-Semple, could I begin with why it's important to the diaspora?
Absolutely.
And then I'll come back to the connection, the significance to the continent. I just want to say that in many ways that the DRC, that Congo Brazzaville, of course, neighboring Congo Kinshasa, those areas were where 46 to 54% of all enslaved Africans were brought. And when we talk about Africans who were brought to the United States or to the island of Hispaniola, the countries of Haiti and Dominican Republic, and of course in Brazil, there's a strong Congo element to the foundational African diasporic cultures there. So in many ways, our turning to Congo, looking to Congo, is in some ways a reflection of looking back to home and to raising the question, how are my family members doing at home? When we look at the significance of the Congo to the continent of Africa itself, it is so centrally located that it sits astride Central Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, and West Africa. And if we look at the connections to all of these nations that actually touch Congo, I think we're really looking at a country that if we could turn that country into a productive, peaceful bastion of Black, I'm gonna use the phrase democracy, but I don't want to situate that in just like a Western tradition, but let's just say a bastion of peaceful Black pro-people's, pro-Black politics, then I think you really could, in many ways, turn the entire continent of Africa around. Some people have used the analogy, I think it was Fanon, talked about Africa in some ways being shaped like a gun, that Congo being like the trigger. But I think of Malcolm and I think of Patrice Lumumba, who saw the significance of the Congo, and Lumumba in particular, subscribing to the brand of Pan-Africanism that Kwame Nkrumah espoused. And in many ways, Lumumba was an Nkrumahist type of Pan-Africanist, meaning that he wanted national sovereignty, national independence for the people of the Congo, but he didn't just want it for one ethnic group. And when we contrast, the type of politics that Lumumba subscribed to compared to his president and so-called boss, President Kasavubu was more so an ethnic nationalist. But, we look at the politics of the MNC, the multinational Congolese political party. The only political party that was able to garner a national voice, that was Lumumba's perspective. And in many ways, if Lumumba and the MNC had been successful in creating this peaceful, productive, Black autonomous space, the continent of Africa would look completely different from the way that it looks today.
On that point, on October 10th, 1958, Patrice Lumumba was elected president of the Mouvement National Congolais organization. What drove him into politics?
That's a great question. Of course, I have to give credit to Dr. George Nzongola Ntalaja for his phenomenal research on Patrice Lumumba. And I would say he is the real expert. Perhaps, you might want to have a conversation with Dr. Nzongola. I do think from reading his work and then reading other sources about Lumumba, I think his experience of working in the post office and actually having a sense of the civic life of the country of the Congo. Congo being colonized by the Belgians since the 1870s under King Leopold II, was almost literally raped of its resources, ripped off of its resources in diamonds and rubber and other natural resources that benefited the Belgians for decades. And I think it is the idea that if the Congolese people could serve under this Belgian government, this colonial government, and enrich this tiny European nation, which is a fraction of the size of Congo, then the question had to have become very, very apparent in his mind of, this country could benefit all African people. I mentioned that civil service and him working as a postal clerk, unfortunately being considered and classified by the Belgian system. One way that they created a divide and rule was that they created this class of Congolese people that they called the évalués, like those who had evolved culturally into a sense of European culture. Well, Lumumba was a part of that class. And I would say that in many ways, the contradiction between that cultural elitist type of category, which was not created by Congolese people, but by the Belgians, to be very, very clear, as a way to divide and rule. I think those contradictions had to become very, very clear to Patrice Lumumba as well. And that the struggle to achieve a national consciousness and a national political ideology that carried that consciousness, and the organization that could actually execute on that political ideology had to have developed as a logical extension of the struggle to actually think through as an African person, as a Congolese person, as opposed to being this évalué, so-called evolved status that the Belgians tried to foist on many educated Congolese people. I don't know. I think that's a simple way of of looking at how he got into politics. But I do think that there's a tradition of resistance amongst the Batetela people from which Patrice Lumumba claimed heritage. And that, we talk about the Batetela uprising at the close of the 19th century, opening of the 20th century as a possible precedent as well. But I think there's that heritage. I would say that it's the rise of the Nkrumah Pan-Africanists and the rise of Pan-Africanism in general that swept up many African leaders. And I think Lumumba, being the very astute person, recognized that I'm not going to hold on to this little class privilege status that the Belgians had tried to give him and other Congolese people, but the true path toward the future was in banking on Pan-Africanism and the rise of African liberation, which was a fundamental goal of that Pan-Africanist movement.
In 1956, Lumumba was invited with others on a study tour of Belgium, as you mentioned, under the auspices of the Minister of Colonies. On his return, he was arrested on a charge of embezzlement from the post office. Sounds like Marcus Garvey, doesn't it? He was convicted and condemned 1 year later, after various reductions of sentence, to 12 months imprisonment and a fine. Why did Patrice Lumumba provoke such intense emotion? After all, his viewpoints were not exceptional.
That's a very good question. I think it's the clarity and the conviction with which Lumumba expressed his views. And this is, in my class, I teach a class in Intro to Africana Studies, which introduces students to the history of the Congo, and we read Dr. Nzingola's biography of Lumumba. And this is one of the questions that always comes up, the fact that he was convicted of this embezzlement charge. There's no excuse, of course, for it, but to say that the Congolese people, even these civil servants, were kept in a status of near poverty. I don't say I agree with and endorse, the stealing of the funds, which apparently were very, very small, that I do see how the Congolese people were basically just impoverished and in many ways forced in a position. Many people will recognize that if, you're given the choice of hunger and taking funds. I don't agree with it, but, I think we force African people quite often, we kind of like do that microanalysis instead of looking at the big picture of the systems that actually deprive African people of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in many ways all across the globe. Lumumba spoke against that system and recognized that taking the reins of power in many ways was the only way that we were going to actually be able to change the course of the system that robbed African people on a daily basis.
Before we move on to Medgar Evers, just briefly, Dr. Livingston, was the Soviet Union's support for Lumumba a threat to many in the West?
I would say that that's always a ruse in many ways. I say it's a ruse. I really think that the United States and the West were more afraid of the rising tide of the non-aligned movements, the non-aligned nations, I should say, who represented in Indonesia, and of course in Ghana, in Algeria, and many other places. And I think that's really what scared the hell out of the United States. The excuse has always been, well, you get, Congo could become a Cuba in Africa, that idea. And then you'd have all of these African dominoes falling into the European sphere of power. And, that's an excuse. I think more so, the United States was interested in maintaining a colonial relationship with Africa, and especially the Congo, where it got its uranium, where it was beginning to get its titanium, and all these other critical minerals that were essential to building up this superpower. And that idea, and here's the thing that becomes very, very problematic, is that Lumumba doesn't say, hey, we're not going to trade with you. He doesn't say that. He says, we'll trade with you, but you're going to treat us as equal humans. You're going to have to trade with us. You're not going to be able to just have a dictator in place, Mobutu Sese Seko, Joseph Mobutu, who became Mobutu Sese Seko, or Moise Tshombe. That I think that, of course, Lumumba was different, because Lumumba essentially insisted on this idea of we can trade as equal partners, but we will not accept the same colonial relationship. And I think that is really what scared the United States. The excuse of Russia is just that. I would argue it's an excuse, but they mainly wanted to maintain that colonial relationship.
About midnight, a shot rang out. It was June 12, 1963, in a suburban neighborhood of Jackson, Mississippi. A 37-year-old civil rights activist, Medgar Evers, had just come home after a meeting of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. As he began the short walk up to his single-story house, the bullet struck Evers in the back. He staggered up to the steps of the house, then collapsed. His family encountered racism on a daily basis. When Medgar Evers was 12 years old, a family friend was lynched, and the man's bloody clothing was hung on a fence for more than a year as a sign of intimidation. What could this have done to his young mind, Dr. Livingston?
Well, I think it had to have had the impact that it had on many Black leaders in the South who were witness to the violence of lynching, whether they be Elijah Poole, who would become the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, or whether it was Benjamin Elijah Mays, all of whom they witnessed the violence meted out against Black folks. And I think that intent, the violent intent of those acts, those assassinations, those murders, was just that. No lynching was simply apolitical. I reject that idea. Every single one of these lynchings was intended to intimidate, to browbeat, to intimidate the Black community to accept a status that was next to slavery, if not the status of slaves in all but except in name. So I think that it had to have had, the violence had to have had that impression, but of course, there's the response to the violence. And this is why I love studying and teaching about Black people. Black folks have never been intimidated to the point of being frozen in place. I don't care where you talk about. Black people have always resisted. We always resist, and we always will. Now, with Medgar Evers, I admire him so much. In undergrad, the story written by his wife for Us the Living, I have the book here, a very, very old copy. It was one of my favorite books in undergrad. And I received his story really through the telling of his wife, Myrlie Evers. I just really appreciated the way that she lovingly told that story. And I would say that same type of love and commitment that you see between those two, between Myrlie Evers and Medgar Evers, is in some ways indicative of the love that Medgar Evers had for African people, not just in the state of Mississippi, but Black people in America and Black people really globally as well. As the man possessed somewhat of a international consciousness as well. So I think the intent was to frighten, but the actual result was that Medgar Evers was committed to the liberation of Black people and would not let anyone intimidate him. And I of course, there's so many lessons that our students, young people, grown folks today that we can take from Medgar Evers' life, as well as Patrice Lumumba.
Why did his murder receive national attention and made him a martyr to the cause of the civil rights movement?
When he was murdered, he was carrying a box of T-shirts. I visited the home, and the blood stain is still there on the concrete. It's hard to believe, from 1963 to today. But he was carrying a box of T-shirts, and the T-shirts read, "Jim Crow must go." In some ways, it's kind of like a simplistic statement, but the desire for freedom, the idea of the freedom struggle, is based upon a very simple premise, that there is an equality between each single person who lives in a given social contract within a given state. Medgar Evers was trying to exercise that right to vote and to get Black people to be able to exercise that right of governance. Sometimes some of my radical brothers, we kind of downplay the significance of voting, say, oh, just want people to vote. Voting, it's a currency, but it's the gateway to governance. It's not the only gateway, but it's almost like you can't engage in banking if you don't have currency in your account. That those votes are currency. Medgar Evers recognized that. And he didn't just want us to vote. He wanted us to exercise and to engage in the levers of power, in Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi, and in the United States of America. And I would say that, of course, if Medgar Evers had lived, that he would have been a part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party movement that Brother Bob Moses was a part of, that Fannie Lou Hamer and Unita Blackwell and all these great Black leaders. But they recognize that the ideology is great, the vision is great, but you have to have a political mechanism that is going to deliver on that vision. And if you don't have that political mechanism, which basically is a political organization or a political party in this case, then in many ways, you're just talking philosophy. And there's nothing wrong with philosophy, but how do you deliver on the philosophy? How do you deliver goods and services to the people who need them? And especially in Mississippi, which lags in so many categories.
Medgar Evers certainly was a champion in getting people registered to vote.
We're not just interested in voting so that conditions will be improved for Negroes. We want conditions improved for everybody. I've had a number of threatening calls, people calling me saying that they were going to kill me, saying that they were going to blow my home up, and saying that I only had few hours to live.
As we know today in America, the voting rights are being questioned and debated.
Absolutely. Today, I think his message rings very clear for anyone who is interested in justice and freedom and equality of all people.
He was even denied admission to the Mississippi Law School simply because of the color of his skin.
Absolutely. I don't know if it wound up being something that would have altered his trajectory, his biographical trajectory and course of his life. But I think it added just another log on the fire for justice in Medgar Evers. And, his brother, Charles, they both shared this desire for freedom. Charles took I would say is a slightly different path in terms of, engagement with conservative politics. But I think Medgar Evers would have been, alongside, of course, the NAACP. Of course, he's a field secretary. But I think he would have used those skills, those legal skills and credentials to advance the freedom struggle, which involve, of course, like we said, the right to vote, but not just the right to vote, but the right to engage and to exercise power within government,
What are a few of the similarities and or differences between Patrice Lumumba and Medgar Evers?
Of course, besides the fact that they're born on the exact same day as you pointed out, July 2nd, 1925, but they're both born into, of course, communities that suffered from neo-slavery and from continuing colonialism. Of course, colonialism in Congo and neo-slavery in Mississippi. I think it should be very, very clear that they both sought to participate in a political organization. For Medgar Evers, he saw that as the NAACP. And being very clear too, Myrlie Evers, she was very critical of the NAACP. You read in For Us to Living and other places where she feels like in some places where he's almost like out here on an island by himself, okay? In some ways, we see a similar situation with Lumumba. He sees, of course, the movement National Congolais as the political party, the political mechanism to deliver on rights for the Congolese people. but in many ways, he's still exposed. He's not protected. He has no real protection for these very resounding calls for freedom and justice. But I would say also, he is not a militant. I think, that's one of the similarities. The Congolese struggle was not a struggle before the rise of Lumumba, where it was just characterized by a military struggle to gain rights against the Congolese people. Now, once Lumumba is assassinated, the MNC is neutralized in the western part of the country. It remains in the eastern part, in Oriental province and in Kasai and other in the areas to the east. But it's very much similar to the African-American struggle in that they begin pushing what Kwame Nkrumah called positive action campaign of protesting, of organizing, and really it's through that organizational activity. And I have to give credit to all the range of political organizers in Congo leading up to 1961 independence, even Abako. Political parties like Abako under Kasavubu and the MNC, that was the vehicle for the Congolese struggle. And it is in many ways similar to the struggle for democracy, for the engagement, the right to engage in governance, including the right to vote, that we see in the African-American struggle. So I think those are two similarities. Other similarities, of course, they both die for this cause. They both die. They live their lives for the cause. They know that their lives are in danger. And both of their partners are telling them, both of them also, they support them, and they eventually become martyrs for the cause. Lumumba dying 2 years before Medgar Evers. I think their lives are just so profound. They're very clear in terms of the primary value that I always encourage my students. They can interpret their lives, the lives of Medgar Evers and Lumumba, how they will, but you can't deny the commitment that these two had toward the cause of achieving African liberation, either in the United States of America or in Congo.
Byron de la Beckwith, a white segregationist, was charged with the murder of Medgar Wiley Evers. He was set free in 1964 after 2 trials resulted in hung juries, but was convicted in a 3rd trial held in 1994. Beckwith was given a life sentence, and in 2001, he died in prison. On January 17, 1961, Patrice Lumumba and 2 associates, Joseph Okito and Maurice Mpolo, were flown to Elizabethville, where they were delivered to the secessionist regime in Katanga and its Belgian advisors. Later that day, Lumumba, Okito, and Mpolo were executed by a firing squad under Belgian command. Although their bodies were initially thrown into shallow graves, they were later dug up under the direction of Belgian officers, hacked into pieces, and dissolved in acid or burned by fire. My special guest, Dr. Samuel Livingston, earned his PhD in African American Studies at Temple University. His recent research includes the essay, An Unbroken Bond, The Place of Africa in Martin Luther King Jr.'s Liberation Thought and Praxis. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Samuel Livingston, on the Ron Bobb-Semple International Podcast as we remember the life and time of 2 historical icons in the African community, Patrice Lumumba and Medgar Evers. Asante sana, Tengi.
Thank you, brother. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for spending some time with us. If you are so inclined, you can subscribe to these podcasts and donate to them by clicking on the Support the Show button on the website. Please continue to protect yourself and your loved ones during this global pandemic by observing all protocols. Be safe, be strong, and be aware. I'm Ron Bobb-Semple.